All right, welcome everyone to another deep dive. And today we're getting into something a little, a little morbid, I guess. We're talking about startup failure.
Morbid. I don't know about that. I think it's actually pretty fascinating stuff and honestly super relevant, even if you're not, launching a company anytime soon.
True, true. Like, who hasn't had an idea that seemed genius in their head, but then it just completely flopped in reality? I know I have plenty of time.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And that's part of what Tom Eisenmann gets into in the fail-safe startup, which is where we're getting all this juicy info from today. It's like, even before we analyze why startups fail, we've got to look at our own biases when thinking about it.
Right. Like that single cause fallacy thing he talks about. We want to simplify things, so we blame the CEO or the marketing or whatever, but it's almost never that simple.
It's so tempting to oversimplify, right? But Eisenmann's point is that it's rarely just one thing that brings a company down. He uses the example of a presidential campaign failing. Everyone wants to point to that one misstep, but the reality is way more complex.
Oh, yeah, I can see that. Like blaming a loss on neglecting a key swing state, when really it was a whole bunch of factors.
Exactly. And then there's the fundamental attribution error, which is kind of similar. It's like we overestimate the person's personality as the reason for failure, and we completely ignore all the external factors that might have been at play.
So someone's startup fails, and we just assume they were lazy or incompetent instead of considering like what was happening in the market at the time or just plain bad luck.
Totally. It's a good reminder to be more nuanced, in our analysis, even when we're not talking about business. Like, judging people is easy, understanding the situation is harder.
For sure. Okay, so we've got to be mindful of our own biases when we're trying to understand why startups fail. But then Eisenman gets into some specific patterns of failure, starting with the early stage. Why do so many promising ideas never even get off the ground?
Well, statistically, most startups fail early on, so understanding those patterns is key. He breaks them down into three main categories: bad bedfellows, false starts, and false positives.
All right, let's unpack those. Bad bedfellows. Kind of makes me think of roommate horror stories.
Exactly. It's all about misalignment, not just with your co-founders, but investors, partners, anyone whose goals or working styles just clash with yours.
The book talks about Baru, that pet care service.
Mhm.
They had this angel investor, great reputation, seemed like a perfect match.
But then it turned out this investor was actually super disruptive, scared off other potential funders. Sometimes the best fit on paper just doesn't work out in reality.
A good reminder to, like, really do your due diligence. Don't just get swept up in the excitement of someone wanting to invest. What about false starts? I feel like I've personally experienced a few of those in my life.
Oh, I'm sure we all have. This is that classic mistake of jumping straight into building a product or solution without actually doing enough customer research to see if it's something people actually want.
Oh, yeah, totally guilty of that. I know what people need.
Ugh.
Classic mistake. Isn't this where Eisenman talks about that double diamond design framework?
He does. And it's a great tool to bring up because it's not just for startups. Anytime you're trying to solve a problem, this framework forces you to really define the problem thoroughly and to explore a bunch of solutions before you commit to anything.
So it's like double checking your map and route before you set off on a road trip instead of assuming you know the best way to get there.
That's a great analogy. He uses the case study of Triangulate, which was this online dating platform. The founder was so focused on the tech, he didn't even stop to figure out what people actually wanted from dating.
Ouch. That's
Yeah.
gotta hurt. It reminds me of how, like, even the most brilliant tech is useless if it's solving the wrong problem. Makes you wonder, how could our listeners apply this double diamond thinking to their own work? Any quick tips?
Well, first off, involve your potential users or customers or whoever early and often. Get their feedback on the problem itself, not just the solution you've already dreamed up.
Hmm.
And then, actually be open to changing course based on what you learn.
Love that. Okay, on to that last early stage pitfall, false positives. This one sounds emotionally rough.
It can be brutal. This is when a startup finds success early on, but it's within a very specific niche market.
Mhm.
And they get all excited thinking they've made it, but then that success just doesn't translate when they try to go mainstream.
It's like being the best band in your tiny hometown, and then you go to the big city and crickets.
Perfect analogy.
Yeah.
The book uses fab.com. They were doing amazingly with these flash sales for designy people. But then they tried expanding their products, appealing to everyone, and it totally backfired.
So the lesson there is early success is not a guarantee. You've got to be really strategic about how you scale up.
And always, always do your research. Don't just assume what works for a small group will work for everyone.
Okay, so those are the early stage traps. But what about companies that make it past that point? They start to grow, things are looking good. What new dangers do they face?
That's when the late stage failure patterns kick in. And things get way more complex because the stakes are higher, resources are stretched thinner,
Yeah.
every decision has a bigger impact.
The first one Eisenman covers is the speed trap. Now, I love going fast, so I'm a little confused by this one. What's the problem with speed?
It's not speed itself, but unsustainable speed. Imagine a company growing so fast they can't even handle their own success.
Ooh, okay, I see. It's like slamming the gas pedal in a car that has shaky brakes.
Exactly. Operations can't keep up, product quality drops, customer service goes out the window. Yep. It all just starts to fall apart.
The book uses the example of Dod& Bow, the furniture company. They had this explosive growth, but then they just couldn't handle the flood of orders.
Yeah, they had huge backlogs, customers got frustrated, and it just snowballed. It shows how even a good thing, like fast growth, can become a liability if you're not careful.
So how do you know when your speed is becoming a problem? What signs should entrepreneurs be on the lookout for?
Well, one big one is listening to your customers. Are complaints increasing about service, about product quality? And then internally, is your team constantly putting out fires, feeling overwhelmed? Those are definitely red flags.
Great advice. Now let's shift gears a bit to a pattern that sounds a little more philosophical, cascading miracles.
Yes. This one is interesting. It's about those ventures that basically rely on a whole chain of unlikely events happening perfectly for them to even have a chance at success, like winning the lottery and then using your winnings to buy another winning ticket, and so on.
Okay, that does sound miraculous. What kind of company would fall into this trap?
Well, the book uses Better Place as an example. They had this goal of creating a global network of electric car charging stations, which sounded amazing.
Yeah.
But it relied on so many things going exactly right. Government supporting it, people buying electric cars, the technology advancing at a certain pace.
And as we know, not all of those miracles came true. So what's the lesson here? Should people just not dream big?
No, not at all. It's not about avoiding ambition, but about being realistic. When your entire plan hinges on a bunch of external factors you can't control, well, your odds of success are pretty slim. It's much better to have backup plans, to be adaptable in case those miracles don't show up.
Makes sense. Okay, last one for this section. Help wanted. Seems like a universal problem, not just for startups.
It is. But for startups, it can be especially tough because as you grow, you suddenly need specialists, experts in areas that you, as the founder, might have any clue about. Like, if you're a tech genius, how do you know if you're hiring a good marketing person?
Right. It's like asking me to judge a cooking competition when I can barely boil water.
Exactly. Dodbo had this issue. They needed a strong operations leader, but they made a few bad hires before they found the right person. It shows how important it is to be self-aware.
Like knowing your limitations, being willing to seek outside help, whether it's advisors, mentors, or just admitting you don't have all the answers.
It's about building a diverse team with skills that complement each other and then trusting those people to do what they do best.
So we've talked about bad partners, rushing to market, relying on miracles. It all sounds pretty daunting. Is there any hope for startups out there?
Oh, there's definitely hope. Remember, these are just patterns. They're not destiny. By knowing about them and by applying good design and management principles, entrepreneurs can increase their chances of success significantly.
Okay, good. That's reassuring. But what about those who stumble? Can they ever recover from these pitfalls? That's what we'll dig into after a quick break.
Welcome back, everyone. So we've covered a lot of ground already, those sneaky psychological biases, the different ways startups can trip up in both the early and later stages. But now, let's get to what I think is the most interesting part. What does it actually mean to fail well?
It's a fascinating concept, right? Not about celebrating failure, of course, but about recognizing that sometimes it just happens despite our best efforts. And there are definitely better and worse ways to handle it when it does.
Right, like it's the difference between crashing and burning versus making a strategic retreat, like you said before.
Exactly. And Eisman starts the section of the book with the pattern he calls running on empty. And I think anyone who's ever been really passionate about a project can relate to this one. Oh, yeah, I know I can. It's that stubbornness, that persistence, even when all the signs are screaming at you that the idea just isn't working. It's like you're emotionally attached to the outcome no matter what the data's telling you.
The book has some really powerful stories of founders who did just that. They get pushing, pouring in more time, money, even sacrificing their own well-being long after it was clear that a turnaround was unlikely.
It's heartbreaking to read those stories, but I can totally see how it happens. Passion is powerful, but sometimes it blinds you, right? So, how do you know when it's time to call it quits versus when to keep fighting for that vision?
Man, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? There's no easy answer. But one thing Eisenman emphasizes is the importance of getting outside perspectives, like talk to mentors, advisors, people who aren't as emotionally invested in the project. They can often provide a more objective view of the situation.
It's so easy to get tunnel vision when you're deep in the trenches, like we talked about earlier. Stepping back, inviting that feedback can make a huge difference.
For sure. And it's about honestly assessing the situation too. Are you actually making progress toward your goals, or are you just delaying the inevitable? Sometimes letting go is the bravest and the smartest thing you can do.
Okay, so let's say you DO realize it's time to shut down. That's got to be tough. But this shutting down gracefully section offers some really good guidance.
It's all about minimizing the harm to everyone involved, your employees, your investors, your partners. And the book outlines three main approaches: bankruptcy, assignment for the benefit of creditors, and a workout.
Okay, those terms sound a little intimidating if I'm being honest. Could you walk us through each of those approaches in a way that makes sense, even if someone's not a lawyer or financial expert?
Sure, of course. Bankruptcy is probably the most familiar term. Basically, it's a legal process where you're declaring that you can't pay your debts. It involves going through court proceedings, and it can be quite complex. Then there's assignment for the benefit of creditors. This one is a bit less formal. It involves assigning your company's assets to a third party, and they sell those off to pay your creditors.
Okay, makes sense. And what about a workout? What does that entail?
A workout is a more collaborative approach. Instead of going through the courts, you work directly with your creditors, try to restructure your debts, and see if there's any way to salvage at least some part of the business. It's often seen as a more favorable option than bankruptcy because it can help preserve relationships and your reputation.
So it sounds like which approach is best really depends on the specifics of the company, their financial situation, and all that.
Exactly. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. And in any case, it's crucial to get expert advice from lawyers and financial professionals who can guide you through the process.
Good point. You know, it's interesting Eisenman brings up Baru's story again in this section. It seems like their experience is woven throughout the book, almost like a case study in both what to do and what not to do when it comes to building a startup.
It really is a compelling example. Remember, even though it meant less money for the investors, Baru's founder prioritized paying his employees and vendors in full. It was a tough decision for sure, but it really speaks to his integrity and his commitment to doing the right thing.
It's a great reminder that even in the face of failure, you still have the opportunity to make choices that align with your values, to do right by the people you work with. Okay, so we've covered recognizing when it's time to shut down and how to do it gracefully. But thankfully, Eisenman doesn't leave us on a totally gloomy note. He ends the section with a really uplifting discussion about bouncing back.
This is where things start to feel hopeful. He shares stories of entrepreneurs who faced those setbacks, those failures, but instead of letting it define them, they used it as a springboard to even bigger and better things. Proof that failure doesn't have to be the end of the story.
He specifically mentions Christina Wallace, co-founder of Quincy Apparel, as a great example of this.
Yeah, Christina's story is amazing. She went through a rough time after Quincy shut down, but she took that time to reflect, to learn from what went wrong, and she adapted her approach. She went on to find success in other ventures, proving that resilience can really pay off.
Her story, and the stories of so many other entrepreneurs featured in the book, really highlight the power of resilience and that adaptability you talked about earlier.
I couldn't agree more. Those are such crucial ingredients in the recipe for success, especially in the constantly changing world of startups.
And they're qualities that you can cultivate, you can strengthen over time. It's almost like failing well is a training ground for developing those traits in a way.
That's a great way to put it. It's not about seeking out failure, of course, but it's about reframing how we view it. It can be a powerful teacher if we're open to learning from it.
So we've talked about the what not to do's and the how to fail well, but what about being proactive from the start? Is there a magic formula for building a fail-safe startup right out of the gate?
I wish. If there were, we'd all be millionaires, right? There's no guaranteed path to success. But Eisenman does offer a really helpful framework for increasing your odds of building a venture that thrives. He calls it the diamond and square framework, And he uses a really clever visual analogy.
Ooh, I love a good visual analogy. Tell me more about this diamond and square business.
All right, so picture a diamond. That diamond represents your venture concept. It has four key elements: your customer value proposition, your profit formula, the key resources you need to deliver on that value proposition, and the key processes you'll use to make it all work.
So it's about making sure those four elements are all working together, right? Like a brilliant product that no one can afford to buy isn't exactly a recipe for success.
You got it. Now imagine a square surrounding that diamond. That square represents your key resource providers, you, as the founder, your team, your investors, and any strategic partners you bring on board.
Ah, so it's not just about the idea itself, but about the people who are bringing it to life. And just like those elements inside the diamond need to be in harmony, so do the players represented by that square.
Precisely.
Hmm.
If there's misalignment within the square, whether it's with co-founders, investors, or partners, it can create all sorts of tension, conflict, and ultimately derail the whole venture. It's like trying to build a house with a team of architects and builders who all have completely different visions for what the final product should look like. It's just not going to work.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Eisenman uses Quincy apparel again here, right, to illustrate this framework.
He does, and it's such a clear example of how things can fall apart when the diamond and square is out of whack. Their initial concept was promising, but they struggled to get the right people on board, to secure the right funding, to form those strategic partnerships. Their diamond and square was misaligned, and ultimately, that played a role in their demise.
So this framework seems like an incredibly valuable tool, not only for diagnosing potential weaknesses in an existing startup, but also for building a really solid foundation from the get-go. It forces you to think critically about all the different pieces of the puzzle and how they fit together.
I couldn't agree more. It's simple, but it's powerful. It helps you visualize those complex dynamics that are at play in any startup. And it really drives home the point that success isn't just about a brilliant idea. It's about executing that idea with the right people, the right resources, and the right processes in place.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the initial stages of starting up, but what happens when a company starts to experience that rapid growth? Are there specific frameworks or models that can help entrepreneurs navigate the challenges of scaling effectively?
There are, and Eisenman dedicates a whole section of the book to this, aptly titled Growing Pains. He acknowledges that scaling a business can be just as daunting, if not more so, than getting it off the ground in the first place.
That makes sense. I mean, the landscape changes so quickly, and what worked in those early days might not be effective or sustainable once a company starts to grow rapidly.
Exactly. To help entrepreneurs navigate this tricky terrain, he introduces something called the 6S framework.
Ooh, six S's. That sounds interesting. I'm ready to dive in. What are those S's and how do they relate to those growing pains you mentioned?
The 6S's stand for speed, scope, staff, structure, systems, and shared values. Each of these plays a crucial role in how a company scales, and failing to manage them effectively can lead to those late-stage failure patterns we were talking about earlier, like the speed trap.
Ah, yes, the speed trap. That's where a company's rapid growth ends up outpacing its ability to keep up, causing problems with operations, product quality, and customer service. So I'm guessing speed is the first S on the list.
You got it. Managing that rapid growth is such a delicate balancing act. It can be exciting, it can bring a lot of benefits, but it can also put immense pressure on a company's infrastructure, its systems, even its culture.
Dot and Bo's struggles with handling that sudden surge in orders is a perfect example of what can go wrong when you don't manage that speed well.
It is. They were completely caught off guard, their systems couldn't handle it, and their customer service really took a hit. So, for anyone who's experiencing that kind of fast growth, what are some things they can do to keep their speed in check and avoid hitting that speed trap?
That's a great question. It seems like being able to anticipate and plan for that growth is crucial, but how do you actually do that?
One of the key things Eisenman emphasizes is to really dig into your customer cohorts. Are you seeing any signs of market saturation? Are those new customers as profitable as your early adopters? Are your acquisition costs going up? These are all important questions to ask.
Right. It's about understanding what's driving your growth and making sure it's sustainable growth, not just a temporary spike driven by unsustainable marketing or hype.
Exactly. It's about building a business that can scale gracefully, not just grow quickly for the sake of growing quickly.
Okay, so we've tackled speed. What about scope? How does that factor into those challenges of scaling up?
Scope is all about how broadly you're defining your business, your product lines, your geographic reach, your level of vertical integration. It can be tempting to think that expanding in all these areas is always a good thing, but it can create a whole new set of challenges if you're not careful.
So, wanting to offer more products or services, wanting to expand into new geographic markets, wanting to control more of your supply chain, I can see how those desires seem like natural ways to grow, but how can those decisions backfire?
Well, let's take product line expansion, for example. It might seem like a no-brainer to increase revenue and reach new customers,
Mm.
but it can also dilute your focus. It can create internal competition for resources and even confuse your existing customer base. Eisenmann uses the story of Fab.com as a cautionary tale here.
Right. Their pivot from flash sales, which they were doing so well with, to a broader e-commerce model, it seemed logical at the time, but it ended up diluting their unique value proposition and put them head to head with giants like Amazon.
Exactly. It's a classic example of biting off more than you can chew. And that same principle applies to geographic expansion too. Moving into new markets can open up those exciting growth opportunities, but it also brings a whole new level of complexity in terms of logistics, regulations, cultural nuances.
Better Places' struggles in different countries are a great illustration of this. They faced all these unexpected obstacles and costs in each new market they entered, which ultimately contributed to their downfall.
It's a great reminder that what works in one market might not work in another. And expanding internationally requires a lot of careful planning and a deep understanding of the local context.
Okay, so we've talked about speed and scope. What's next in our 6S journey?
Next up is staff.
Hmm.
And this one's particularly relevant to our earlier discussion of that help-wanted failure pattern.
Oh.
It's not just about finding the right people, it's about scaling your team effectively as your company grows.
So as your company grows, you need to bring in new people, often in very specialized roles that didn't even exist before. And as we saw with Dodd and Bow and others, finding those specialists and integrating them into your existing team, that can be a real headache.
It can be, and it goes way beyond just looking for talented individuals. It's about building a cohesive, high-performing team that can handle the demands of a rapidly scaling company.
Right, you need people who can not only excel in their individual roles, but who can collaborate effectively, communicate clearly, and who really embrace the company's culture and values.
Exactly. Building that strong team is one of the most crucial elements of successfully scaling a company.
So we've got the people, the staff, but what about the structure of the organization itself? How does that need to evolve as the company grows?
That's where our next S comes in, structure.
Right.
This is about how you organize your company to handle the increased complexity that comes with scaling up. It involves making decisions about things like departmentalization, reporting relationships, those decision-making processes.
So in the early days of a startup, things are often pretty informal, right? Everyone's wearing multiple hats, decisions are made on the fly, there's a lot of flexibility. But as the company grows, you need to bring in more structure.
You do. You need those clear lines of responsibility.
Mhm.
You need formal processes for making decisions, and you need to make sure everyone understands their role within the organization. That helps ensure efficiency, accountability, consistency as you scale.
But too much structure can be a problem too, can it? I can imagine how too much bureaucracy could stifle innovation and create a culture of really slow decision making.
You're absolutely right. It's all about finding the right balance, and that balance is going to be different for every company, depending on their size, their industry, their culture.
It's finding that sweet spot between having enough structure to make sure things run smoothly, but not so much that you squash that creativity and agility that's so crucial in the early stages.
Precisely. And it's an ongoing process, really. You need to constantly adapt and refine your structure as your company evolves.
Okay, so we've covered staff and structure. What's the next S we need to explore?
Next up is systems. And this one's all about those tools and processes that companies use to manage their operations. We're talking everything from accounting software and customer relationship management systems to inventory management tools and everything in between.
Ah, so it's about making sure you have the right technology and infrastructure in place to support your growth.
Exactly. As you scale, the volume and complexity of your operations just skyrocket. Having those robust and scalable systems in place is crucial for maintaining efficiency, accuracy, and responsiveness.
And we've seen firsthand what can happen when those systems aren't up to the task. Dot& Bow's struggles with their ERP system are a prime example.
Totally. Their inability to accurately track inventory and orders led to all sorts of problems with fulfilling those orders, which then impacts customer relationships and ultimately their bottom line.
So investing in those robust and scalable systems, it's not a luxury, it's a necessity for any company that's serious about growing in a sustainable way.
I completely agree. And finally, we arrive at the last S, which might just be the most important of all: shared values.
Shared values. That sounds pretty foundational. What makes this one so crucial, especially in the context of scaling up?
This one's all about your company culture and those principles that guide your company's actions. Remember Ben Horowitz's definition of culture: how your employees make decisions when their boss isn't around.
Ah, yes. That's a great way to put it. It's about creating an environment where everyone is aligned on a set of core values and can make decisions independently that are consistent with those values.
Exactly. And as your company grows, having that strong, clearly defined culture becomes even more important. It helps to track and retain top talent, it ensures consistency in decision making, and it maintains that sense of shared purpose even as the organization gets more complex.
But culture can also become a bit of a challenge as you scale up, right? What worked in the early days, when everyone was in close proximity and the company was small and nimble, it might not translate as well when you have hundreds or even thousands of employees spread across different locations.
That's true. Sometimes a culture that was once a strength can actually become a barrier to growth.
The book mentions Dropbox as a good example of this, right? They had a very engineering-driven culture in the beginning, which worked well for them initially, but as they expanded into new markets and offerings, it became more of a challenge.
Right. They realized they needed to evolve their culture to be more customer-centric and adaptable to different business models. It's a good reminder that culture isn't static. It needs to be nurtured. It needs to be adapted as the company grows and changes.
It's a lot like those other elements in the success framework, isn't it? It's all about constant evolution and adaptation to keep pace with the changing demands of a growing business.
Exactly. And that's really what the Success Framework is all about, providing a practical roadmap for navigating those complexities of scaling a startup. It's not about providing all the answers, but it's about asking the right questions and prompting those important conversations within your organization.
It's a reminder that scaling up isn't just about getting bigger, it's about evolving your structure, your systems, and your culture to handle that growth effectively. It's about laying the foundation for long-term sustainable success.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So, we've covered an incredible amount of ground in this deep dive. Psychological biases, those common failure patterns, different frameworks for building and scaling, even what it means to fail well. It's been a whirlwind of insights, but now as we wrap things up, I'm curious, what are your biggest takeaways? What's really resonating with you?
It really has been a whirlwind, so much to unpack.
Hmm.
I think for me, the biggest takeaway is that, yeah, failure is pretty much inevitable in the startup world. It's not something to be afraid of or ashamed of, but it is something we can learn from.
I agree. Eisenman does a great job of making that point throughout the book. It's like failure isn't the opposite of success. It's almost like a stepping stone on the path to success.
Totally. He even says, studying failure can give us these incredible insights that can help us avoid making those same mistakes in the future. Like that old saying, you learn more from your losses than your wins.
So true. And he's clear that just because a company shows some of those warning signs or falls into one of those patterns we talked about, it doesn't mean they're automatically doomed. Being aware of the patterns is half the battle.
Right. Awareness is huge. It lets entrepreneurs be more proactive, anticipate those potential pitfalls, and actually take steps to, reduce those risks. Like having a map of the danger zones, you might not avoid them all, but you're less likely to walk right into one.
That's a great analogy. It's all about increasing your odds of success by being informed and prepared. So I know you've really dug deep into this book. What were some of the things that stood out to you the most? What were your big aha moments?
One of the things that really stuck with me was Eisenman's emphasis on the importance of thorough customer research. It seems so basic, but you'd be amazed how many startups just skip this step.
Yeah, we saw those cautionary tales like triangulate, spending all that time and energy building something that no one actually wanted. They kind of forgot who they were building it for.
Right. And I think that's where the Double Diamond Design Framework comes in so handy. It forces you to slow down, define the problem clearly, and explore a whole bunch of solutions before you even think about building anything.
I love that framework. And it's not just for businesses either. Anyone can use that in their own projects, whether it's work or personal stuff. Taking that time to understand the problem can save you so much hassle later on.
Absolutely. Another thing that really resonated with me was the importance of adaptability. The startup world changes so fast, you had to be able to pivot, to adjust your strategies as new challenges and opportunities come up.
We've seen how important that is, with stories like Fab.com struggling to keep up when the market shifted.
Yeah, they had so much early success, but they got stuck in their ways. The Success Framework is a great guide for navigating those transitions. But a lot of it comes down to mindset too.
Right. Being willing to let go of what's not working, to embrace new ideas, to constantly experiment.
And I love that Eisenman doesn't shy away from the human side of all this. Building a company is tough, it's emotionally draining, and you need resilience to make it through.
Those stories of the entrepreneurs who bounced back from failure, that's what gives you hope, right? It's knowing that it can be done.
It is. It reminds you that failure isn't the end, it's just like a course correction. So, if I had to give one piece of advice to someone thinking about starting a company, I'd say don't be afraid to fail, but fail smart. Treat it as an experiment, test your assumptions, and be ready to pivot.
Great advice. And it applies to so much more than just startups.
Totally. It's about embracing the journey, learning from those ups and downs, and never forgetting why you started in the first place.
Well, I think that's a perfect note to end on. Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive into the fail-safe startup. We've covered so much ground today, but I hope you all found it as valuable and insightful as I have. Failure is a part of life, and it's a part of business, but it doesn't have to define us.
It doesn't. By studying failure, we can increase our chances of success, and even if things don't go exactly as planned, those lessons we learn along the way, they're priceless.
Couldn't agree more. Thanks again for listening, everyone. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep diving deep.